Hi, everyone. I just want to go over a few of the concepts from the reading for the last couple chapters that we read for this week. So the first one I want to talk about is the hierarchy of suffering. If you were able to join us on the Zoom call last week, we talked about how Holmes does a really great job of showing how the structures in the hierarchies of the labor hierarchies of the farm literally embed inequality into structures. And then in these next few chapters, he looks specifically at the physical suffering that people experience and their encounters with the healthcare providers. So he looks at how labor and other structural hierarchies, and I think the sort of map or chart on page 85 is a really nice example of that, maps closely onto a hierarchy of suffering. So the physical bodily suffering that people are experiencing. And he shows how social forces are linked to such bodily suffering. So you could, on page 85, you could add a column to that chart that talks about the bodily suffering that each of those different labor hierarchies experiences. So in this chapter that you read, one of the chapters you read for this week, the stories of Abelino, Crescencio, and Bernardo clearly demonstrate the linkages between social forces and structures and bodily suffering. And I think this quote is really poignant. He says, the working and living conditions, degree of respect received, and access to political power of each of the groups within the labor hierarchy lead to different forms of suffering from top to bottom. And I think like sometimes we talk about structural inequalities or structural violence, but this book does a really poignant job of very clearly linking structures, both physical and hierarchical or bureaucratic, to physical violence or suffering. Another thing that I wanted to talk about, let me move my camera over here so it's not over the words, is the three aspects of the medical gaze that Holmes talks about. So the first is that, in these encounters that the migrants have with often well-meaning doctors, not always, but is the first is the valuation of the physician's observations and tests over this patient's experiences. So he gives the example of Abelino's discussion of his employment history. He tries to explain to the doctor that that's why he's having this suffering, and that doesn't get a lot of attention, and his symptoms are treated with suspicion by the physicians. So that gets a higher valued over the patient's own experiences. Um, and then the second one is that physicians blame their patients for their suffering and often ignore the structures that produce them. So, like the most obvious example is that a patient they might tell a patient that they're picking incorrectly, and that if they changed how they picked, that they would not have this suffering, rather than looking at the structures that force them to pick under certain conditions without breaks, without good access to healthcare, for too many hours in a row, et cetera, et cetera. So they're not doing that out of malice, but they're doing it out of, under the auspices of trying to find a solution. And then the third aspect of the medical gaze is that structural violence victimizes the suffering person as well as the professional. So it's not just the patient that's victimized, but doctors are working in these highly bureaucratic environments with lots of paperwork, not enough time for each patient, not enough information about the patients and their situations because of this lack of time and these pressures to see as many patients as possible, to provide them with good care. So it's not just bad for the patients, it's bad for the physicians as well. Okay, and then the next thing I want to talk about is the symbolic violence and what Holmes calls, or how Triqui get blamed for their suffering. So the first idea that he talks about is normalization. And if you've taken any other classes with me, and we probably talked about it in this class, I talk a lot about naturalization. We'll get to that in a moment, and this is a corollary of that. But normalization is that people get used to seeing conditions in which people live and work, like the fruit pickers, and it stops worrying or surprising them. So they drive past or walk past or bike past these fields all the time and see pickers picking and never think like, oh, they don't seem to be getting a lot of days off, or that looks like an uncomfortable position to work in, or I wouldn't want to do that kind of work for 6 months out of the year for my entire life. And so one of the things that I want to think about, one of the follow-up questions for this week I'm going to put on there is if you can think about anything similar where suffering gets normalized or naturalized in our society, that we see something so frequently that we don't stop to think like, is it okay that this is how things are happening. And then naturalization is kind of related to that. It's not just that you become used to seeing something, is that you think it's natural to someone to do something in a certain way. So this is like naturalization is an interesting thing to analyze in relation to labor, because a lot of times we do naturalize labor. So for example, there's been, people will often say like, because there's a lot of technology factories in Asia, people will say, or sweatshops, people say like Asian women are particularly well suited to doing this kind of work because they have small hands or something like that. Whereas we know perfectly well that all humans have the digits necessary to do, to assemble computer parts. But we naturalize that along lines of race or class or ethnicity. So naturalization is when people in this case is that people assume that, for example, like, oh, here's these Triqui indigenous Mexicans that are used to living in rural communities. They probably live in a shack. They live with lots of people in a household. So living in these labor camps is natural to them. They're used to it, and their bodies are used to it, and they're well suited for this work. It comes natural to them. And so that's one of the, but just because, so even if that were true, we still need to question whether that's right. But often we're in, there's grave differences between living away from your family in these crowded shacks and living in a community with your family in a rural area. So, and then the last one, and then we'll think about that too. What else becomes naturalized that we think, oh, it's like sometimes they're good stereotypes, like Black people are faster runners or Asians are good at math. There's good stereotypes get naturalized. And if you've taken my intro class, that you know that those are also harmful. First of all, because not everybody fits that mold, but also because the logic that rests on, if you sort of accept that Asians are better at math, then you also might accept that Asians are blank, fill in with a negative thing, because you're accepting a logic that links a value, ability, or practice that's not biological at all or that's not racial. Someone might have like biological aptitude for a certain subject or a certain sport, but it can't be linked to a race. And so accepting that it is linked to a race makes the logic that says like it's okay that Triqui people have to pick these fruits in these poor labor conditions. So we'll think a little bit more about what other examples of that we have in our society. And then the last one is internalization. And this is sort of the follow-up to that. If you hear in society and you observe that people are saying these things about your community, and treating you in a certain way, people themselves internalize this, and you see this in narratives of slaves or slaves who are freed, having a hard time kind of accepting that they're equally valuable humans. But in this case, the Triqui migrants themselves internalize some of the messages. And I think like the really obvious example that he gives is that they say only white pickers are bothered by pesticides and they don't need to wear the protective gears because they're not as sensitive as the white pickers, so they don't need to do that. Whereas in fact they are having health problems because of those things, and those sort of though they're buying into this naturalization argument. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about is Holmes's ideas on race. So he talks about race as shaped by bodily practice, and he's drawing on some scholars, Mary Wisemantel and others, who talk about race, about indigenous ideas about race as being accumulated in the body through practice. And if you read The Circulation of Children in my intro class by Jessica Lineweaver, she talks about how indigenous Peruvians can, as they sort of try to improve their social status, they can also change their race and move out of the indigenous category. So by this logic, one can change their body shape, smell, and therefore their race through different bodily practices. So and we see this embodiment theory kind of even within the farm, that the different kinds of work that the Triqui pickers versus the mestizo pickers have to do produces different kind of odors, and some work is dirtier than others, and those get rooted in ideas about race. And this is a quote from page 165. On the embodiment of race, Holmes says, Whiteness is a set of economic and political privileges passed down from generation to generation that then affects the appearance, shape, and smell of a body. So you can, by this logic, if you moved up the ladder away from being a picker to a supervisor, you could shed some of your markers of indigeneity, and become like a move up the ladder in terms of perceived racial categories. So that's a pretty interesting body of theory that he's building on, specific to how Indigenous Central Americans and South Americans think about race. All right, that's all I got for you today. Hope you enjoy the rest of the book, and I'll see you next week.